Now a hypothesis tree looks like an issue tree, but is actually fundamentally different. This time what we do, we start with a primary hypothesis, and we ask the question, why? Now that primary hypothesis must be a really precise statement. And when we ask the question why, we're asking the question, why must this be true? And we think of all the various things that must be true for the primary hypothesis to be true. Now all of these have to be true for the first thing to be true. If any one of them turns out to be false, then the primary hypothesis is not true. But once again, once we've got a bunch of secondary hypotheses, we repeat the process. We start with a secondary hypothesis, and we think of all the things that have to be true for that to be true. Now what we tend to find in a hypothesis tree is that there aren't as many branches as there are in an issue tree. An issue tree can have 5 or 6 levels. Hypothesis trees tend to be a little bit smaller, but they're much tighter. Basically what you started with is a very tight, precise statement, and then you come up with a number of secondary closed, tight statements, then a number of tertiary ones, and then these are what you can test by direct experiment. Now as an example, I'd like to choose this idea that I can make money by blackmailing somebody. Now blackmailing someone is saying they've done something wrong, let's say, and you know it but not enough other people know it, and so you demand money off them to keep quiet. Now I have to think of all the things that have to be true for this statement to be true. This is a very precise statement. I can make money by blackmailing someone. To tighten this up, I'm going to say I can make money by blackmailing John, whoever John might be. What has to be true for that to be true? Well, for example, John has to have done something bad or shameful. Secondly, you have to have evidence, I suppose, that John has done something bad. So I'll keep this a bit shorter now. I need evidence. What else? Nobody else knows. John wants to keep it quiet. John has money. That's going to be quite important, or at least the ability to go and take out a great big loan in order to pay me. John has to be susceptible to blackmail. I think that's probably falling into a previous camp, in that he has to. What we're really saying there is that John values the silence more than he values the money. You have to also be able to, I suppose, communicate with John. What else? John has no information on you. I suppose you should say that John won't kill you, for example. Kill me, or I suppose we could also, as well as that, say John won't go to the police. I suppose also you've got the idea that I have no competition. Right, once again then, we've put down a lot of ideas, and now we think, how can we divide these up into various areas to make our secondary level of hypotheses? Having done this a few times, I think these fall into 3 camps. If I can sort of put them into those 3 camps, one of them is regarding the potential. There's potential for blackmail. For example, that would be the first one. John's done something bad. Nobody knows. I have evidence. John wants to keep it quiet. John has money, and John is susceptible. These are all things that are regarding the potential for blackmailing. I can make it happen. You could call that perhaps an execution idea. I can actually do it. In other words, I need to communicate with John. That's the sort of second thing. I think there'll be lots of other things in there. We'll come to those in a moment. And finally, we have a sort of consequences bracket, in that things like John won't go to the police, John won't kill me, and so on. And I think that the I have no competition probably falls into the execution or potential area, probably the second area. But anyway, having looked at all these sort of ideas, I've seen they've fallen into 3 brackets. What I'm going to do now is move these right up to the secondary area and write them out as precise statements. So I've written these now as precise statements. So my primary hypothesis is that I can make money by blackmailing John. Now divide that up into 3 things that must be true for the primary hypothesis to be true. To start with, that I have the potential for blackmailing John. Secondly, I can make it happen. And thirdly, it won't have bad consequences for me. Now if any one of those is untrue, then I cannot prove my primary hypothesis. Take each of these in turn and say, is this statement true? So I have the potential for blackmailing John. Well, the first thing that needs to be true is that I have evidence that John has done something wrong. And by wrong there I mean shameful, illegal, something that John is embarrassed about, doesn't want to become public. So the second thing I need is that, well, first of all, John needs to have done something wrong. Secondly, John wants to keep it quiet. That needs to be true. These are all the things that we came up with before. Nobody else knows. John needs to have money. So these are all the things that we thought of the first time round. And while you want to make this list complete, there may well be other things that I haven't yet thought of here. Now, having looked at the first secondary hypothesis, we can now turn our attention to the second and ignore everything in the first side. So the second one is I can make it happen. Now, before we had this idea that I can communicate with John, in other words, my communications won't get intercepted. I think a particular one for me anyway is that I am sufficiently ruthless. You have to be actually prepared to go through with this, taking all the consequences into account. And then I suppose you've also got to do things like I can launder the money. Now, it won't have bad consequences for me. We touched on this before. Again, I've got to think that this is a statement. The blackmail won't have bad consequences for me. I have to think of all the things that must be true for this to be true. And they'd be things like I won't be found out. What else it would be? That John won't kill me. And so on. Now, I haven't spent very much time on that, but there'll be several other things. The point I want to get to is this, that we've taken our primary hypothesis, divided it up now into a bunch of secondary hypotheses, each of which is a precise statement, and then done the process again. We've divided each of the secondary hypotheses into precise statements here. Now, these ones can actually be tested by, if you were doing research, by rigorous research. So you need to test each of these. I have evidence that John has done something wrong. That has a yes or no answer. You can go and gather the evidence, find out, etc., and you'll be able to say yes or no. Let's say that's a tick. John wants to keep it quiet. Well, you can find that out easily enough by asking John. Nobody else knows. Well, that might take you a bit of effort to find out, but again, you could tick that or cross that. John has money. Well, you can find that out for yourself. And so on. I can communicate with John safely. You probably can. I can launder the money. Let's find out. But then you might find I'm sufficiently ruthless. Well, maybe I'm not. Now, the thing is then, everything's going to collapse, because now you can't say that you're sufficiently ruthless, therefore you can't make it happen, therefore you can't make money by blackmailing John. So you find with the hypothesis tree that by asking the question why, you take a precise statement that nevertheless is quite hard to answer into a number of much smaller questions that you can answer with a tick or sometimes a cross, a yes or no answer. Now, if this was scientific, you'd be answering these by rigorous hypothesis-driven research. In this case, it's hardly scientific, but you can apply the same method. So I'd like to summarize by going back a slide, summarize the hypothesis trees. What we do here is we start with a primary hypothesis, and it must be a precise statement. And we ask the question why, and we divide it up into secondary hypotheses again, which must be precise statements which, when gathered together, confirm the primary hypothesis. And we can apply the same treatment again to the secondary hypotheses, and we find tertiary hypotheses often which we can test with a yes or no answer. And if it's a yes to all of these things, then it's a yes to the secondary hypothesis. If it's a yes to all of the tertiary hypotheses on the second side, it's a yes to the secondary hypothesis too, and this goes on until you've ticked everything everywhere, and then you can say with some certainty that the primary hypothesis is true. On the other hand, if you find that one of these is false, you'll find your secondary hypothesis falls down and your primary hypothesis falls down. So it's a very good way of rigorously dividing up a precise hypothesis into lots of small hypotheses that you can test experimentally. It's a very powerful way of structuring your research.